Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sexual Anorexia, Overcoming Sexual Self-Hatred by Patrick Carnes, Ph.D., with Joseph M. Moriarty. Narrated by Terrence Bays. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type Sexual Anorexia into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the Supplemental Content section, please enter the access code AWARENESS, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. Disclaimer: all the stories in this book are based on actual experiences. The names and details have been changed to protect the privacy of the people involved. In some cases, composites have been created. The 12 steps are reprinted with the permission of Alcoholics Anonymous World Services, Incorporated. Permission to reprint and adapt the 12 steps does not mean that AA has reviewed or approved the contents of this publication, nor that AA agrees with the views expressed herein. AA is a program of recovery from alcoholism only. Use of the 12 steps in connection with programs and activities which are patterned after AA, but which address other problems, or in any other non-AA context, does not imply otherwise. Preface. In many ways, this book began in 1983 when I completed Out of the Shadows: Understanding Sexual Addiction. That book described the nature of sexual addiction and the path of recovery from the illness. Yet I knew even then that Out of the Shadows told only part of the story. From that point on, I tried to define sexual addiction as part of a continuum. On one end were people who had lost the ability to regulate their own sexual behavior. On the other extreme were those who could not force themselves to be sexual without dire internal consequences. The two conditions were related. Both obsessional states drew their power from a deep sexual self-hatred. In 1989, I completed Contrary to Love, which described sexual addiction for professionals. The book began with the continuum of compulsive sex and compulsive non-sex. It also described in detail how sex addicts go through periods of de-escalation, in which sex becomes the enemy. The whole process of therapy and recovery is directed towards sexual health, which at that point I only partly defined. Since then, we have witnessed a decade of extraordinary progress. 12-step groups for sexual addiction, such as Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, and Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, have flourished across the country and throughout the world. The National Council on Sexual Addiction and Compulsivity is in its 4th year of publishing a medical journal dedicated to the problem. Inpatient and outpatient programs for sexual addiction have sprung up across the nation. In 1997, 3 basic medical texts included chapters on sexual addiction. In the midst of rapidly expanding awareness about sexual addiction, a growing consciousness about what I call sexual anorexia has also emerged, albeit more slowly. 12-step groups held conferences, published literature, and offered groups to sexual anorexics. The concern was more tentative for sexual anorexia, however, in part because the losses are more hidden. But professionals began to note the connections between sexual acting out and acting in. Those who researched abuse, especially sexual abuse, wrote about traumatic abstinence. Sexologists separated sexual aversion as a more extreme problem than sexual dysfunction. And like the addiction specialists, they now acknowledged a continuum of extremes. Yet, no one book defined the problem for those seeking recovery using a 12-step format. There was no Out of the Shadows for the sexual anorexic. Another problem also started to reveal itself. As I traveled and spoke about recovery, I heard many people ask, "What is healthy sexuality?" In 1991, I wrote more about that in Don't Call It Love, wherein I described 8 dimensions of healthy sexuality. These specific dimensions grew out of the research for that book, which involved interviewing over 1,000 recovering sex addicts and their partners. I used the model of the 8 dimensions in my speeches and workshops. In one such workshop, it dawned on me that the workshop participants already possessed the tools for understanding what it was they sought. Those tools were the very 12-step principles with which they were already familiar in other contexts. Recovering people simply needed to know that they could apply their 12-step skills to their sexuality. When I spoke around the country, I could see how helpful making that bridge was. People started to use the materials, and soon, sexual anorexia, overcoming sexual self-hatred, started to take form. Once I realized how the principles of the 12 steps paralleled the dimensions of healthy sexuality, I expanded the latter from 8 to 12. A matrix matching the now 12 dimensions with 12 supportive strategies for achieving them and the applicable principles of the 12 steps can be found in Appendix A. This matrix provides a quick overview of what this book hopes to accomplish and how to get there. Sexual anorexia fills in the parts for which Out of the Shadows only sketched the outlines. In addition to creating a method for exploring healthy sexuality, this book completes the picture of what sexual anorexia looks like. It also draws connections with sexual addiction and other excessive or deprivation behaviors. In that sense, it might be a bit unsettling for those who like to keep their addiction and compulsive disorders in neat, separate categories. Inpatient providers, as well as outpatient therapists, now understand that those extremes interact with one another, and that, unless the whole web of compulsions and addictions is addressed, the web will continually re-anchor itself in some new, self-destructive constellation. Sexual anorexia and sexual addiction are but 2 of the anchor sites available to the addictive compulsive process. Thus, when I refer in the book to treatment centers, I am referring to those therapeutic institutions that in some manner treat addictions or compulsions. I am speaking most specifically, however, of those organizations that recognize, understand, and in some manner provide services to address the complex interrelation of addictive disorders. A network of therapists, community programs, and residential facilities has emerged that specializes in sex addiction and sexual anorexia, as well as the larger spectrum of addiction, depression, trauma, and various compulsions and phobias. To access this network, call 1-800-708-1796 or visit sexhelp.com. Remember also that although this book focuses primarily on the sexual anorexic and his or her partner, it can be used as well by anyone in any type of recovery program who decides to confront and begin healing sexual issues. Introduction. They suffer silently, consumed by a dread of sexual pleasure and filled with fear and sexual self-doubt. They feel profoundly at odds with a culture that tirelessly promotes sex, but is strangely unconscious about sexuality. It is not inhibited sexual desire they are experiencing, although often they possess a naivete, an innocence, or even a prejudice against sex. It is not sexual dysfunction, although their suffering often wears the mask of physical problems that affect sex. It is not about being cold and unresponsive, although that certainly is a way in which they protect themselves against the hurt. It is not about religious belief, although religious sexual oppression may have been a place to hide. It is not about guilt and shame, although those feelings are powerfully experienced. Nor is it about sexual betrayal or risk or rejection, although those are common themes. It is simply the emptiness of profound deprivation, a silent suffering called sexual anorexia. Sexual anorexia is an obsessive state in which the physical, mental, and emotional task of avoiding sex dominates one's life. Like self-starvation with food, or compulsive debting or hoarding with money, deprivation with sex can make one feel powerful and defended against all hurts. As with any other altered state of consciousness, such as those brought on by chemical use, compulsive gambling or eating, or any other addiction process, the preoccupation with the avoidance of sex can seem to obliterate one's life problems. The obsession can then become a way to cope with all stress and all life difficulties. Yet, as with other addictions and compulsions, the costs are great. In this case, sex becomes a furtive enemy to be continually kept at bay, even at the price of annihilating a part of oneself. The word anorexia comes from the Greek word orexis, meaning appetite. Anorexis, then, means the denial of appetite. When referring to food appetite, anorexia means the obsessive state of food avoidance that translates into self-starvation. Weight concerns and fear of fat transform into a hatred of food and a hatred of the body, because the body demands the nurturance of food. Food anorexics perceive bodily cravings for sustenance as a failure of self-discipline. The refusal to eat also becomes a way for food anorexics to reassert power against others, particularly those who may be perceived as trying to control the anorexic, trying in some manner to prevent the anorexic from being his or her true self. Ironically, many food anorexics are driven by a powerful need to meet unreal cultural standards about the attractiveness of being thin. A terror of sexual rejection rules their thoughts and behaviors, and is a primary force behind this striving for thinness. The irony here is that sexual anorexics share precisely the same terror. Specialists in sexual medicine have long noted the close parallels between food disorders and sexual disorders. Many professionals have observed how food anorexia and sexual anorexia share common characteristics. In both cases, the sufferers starve themselves in the midst of plenty. Both types of anorexia feature the essential loss of self, the same distortions of thought, and the agonizing struggle for control over the self and others. Both share the extreme self-hatred and sense of profound alienation. But while the food anorexic is obsessed with the self-denial of physical nourishment, the sexual anorexic focuses his or her anxiety on sex. As a result, the sexual anorexic will typically experience the following: a dread of sexual pleasure, a morbid and persistent fear of sexual contact, obsession and hypervigilance around sexual matters, avoidance of anything connected with sex, preoccupation with others being sexual, distortions of body appearance, extreme loathing of body functions, obsessional self-doubt about sexual adequacy, rigid, judgmental attitudes about sexual behavior, excessive fear and preoccupation with sexually transmitted diseases, obsessive concern or worry about the sexual intentions of others, shame and self-loathing over sexual experiences, depression about sexual adequacy and functioning, intimacy avoidance because of sexual fear, self-destructive behavior to limit, stop, or avoid sex. Sexual anorexics can be men as well as women. Their personal histories often include sexual exploitation or some form of severely traumatic sexual rejection, or both. Experiences of childhood sexual abuse are common with sexual anorexics, often accompanied by other forms of childhood abuse and neglect. As a result of these traumas, they may tend to carry dark secrets and maintain seemingly insane loyalties that have never been disclosed. In fact, Sexual anorexics are, for the most part, not conscious of the hidden dynamics driving them. Although obsessed with sexual avoidance, they are nonetheless also prone to sexual binging, occasional periods of extreme sexual promiscuity, or acting out, in much the way that bulimics will binge with compulsive overeating and then purge by self-induced vomiting. Sexual anorexics may also compensate with other extreme behaviors, such as chemical or behavioral addictions, codependency, or deprivation behaviors like debting, hoarding, saving, cleaning, or various phobic responses. The families of sexual anorexics may also present extreme patterns of behavior and thought. Finally, the sexual anorexic is likely to have been deeply influenced by a cultural, social, or religious group that views sex negatively and supports sexual oppression and repression. Sexual anorexia, therefore, can wear many masks. Consider the sexual trauma victim who takes care of her pain by compulsively overeating. People focus on her obesity, not noticing the hidden anorexic agenda of avoiding being desirable to anyone. Or think of the alcoholic who has never been sexual except when drinking. The prospect of being sexual while sober is so intimidating that a broader abstinence is embraced. For most sexual anorexics, however, a complex array of extremes exists. When a person's appetites are excessive, we use words like addiction or compulsion. But excesses are often accompanied by extreme deprivations, for which we use terms like anorexia or obsession. In fact, these seemingly mutually exclusive states can exist simultaneously within a person and within a family. The further his drinking and sexual behavior get out of control, the harder and more compulsively his wife works, the more she behaves hyper-responsibly, and the more she shuts down sexually. Anorexia. These disorders are not occurring in isolation. The end result is that the problem of sexual anorexia is not likely to get addressed, because it lacks the clarity and drama of the drinking, the sexual acting out, and the workaholism. People minimize the problem of sexual anorexia. After all, whoever died of a lack of sex? Yet, as we shall see in this book, the physical and psychological consequences of sexual anorexia are severe, and the problem is central to understanding the entire mosaic of extreme behaviors. This book focuses on the suffering of the sexual anorexic. Sexual anorexia is as destructive as the illnesses that often accompany it, and behind which it often hides, such as alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual addiction, and compulsive eating. It resides in emotions so raw that most sufferers would wish to keep it buried forever, were it not so painful to live this way. Sexual anorexia feeds on betrayal, violence, and rejection. It gathers strength from a culture that makes sexual satisfaction both an unreachable goal and a non-negotiable demand. Our media focus almost exclusively on sensational sexual problems, such as rape, child abuse, sexual harassment, or extramarital affairs. When people have problems being sexual, we are likely to interpret the difficulty as a need for a new technique or a matter of misinformation. For those who suffer from sexual anorexia, technique and information are not remotely enough. Help comes only through unintentional, planned effort to break the bonds of obsession that keep anorexics stuck. This book is intended as a guide to support that effort. The early chapters help the reader understand sexual anorexia, how it starts, and how it gathers such strength. The last 12 chapters present a clinically tested and proven plan for achieving a healthy sexuality. This program has worked for many, many people. It is safe. It is practical. It works if the sufferer follows the guidelines and has the appropriate outside support. It will not be easy because the obsession was created in the first place by intimate violations and shattered trust. Yet, step by step, healing can be effected so that the sufferer can learn to trust the self as well as others. The plan is designed to involve a network of external support made up of partners, therapists, close friends, clergy, and so on. The book will explain the importance of having these fair witnesses along the journey to health and freedom. Breaking the isolation is essential to dismantling the dysfunctional beliefs and loyalties that keep people in pain. The material in this book can be used in many settings. Some people have used these materials in the 12-step groups dedicated to sexual problems, many of which now feature subgroups dedicated to sexual anorexia. Couples groups dedicated to recovery, such as Recovering Couples Anonymous, have also used these materials as a guide. Therapists have used them in individual and group therapeutic sessions. Many observers, including myself, have noticed that sexual anorexics are generally competent and willing people. As they face their illness, they begin to reclaim their creativity and start becoming the persons they were meant to be. There is something fundamental about coming to terms with the sexual self, something healing and liberating. In the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the promises of recovery is we shall know a new freedom. This book is dedicated to making that so. Part 1. 1. Sex as fundamental. Appetite for food and sexual drive are related. One is not merely a displacement, symbolization, or substitution for the other. Rather, appetite and sexual drive are related but distinct parts of a constellation of bodily urges that the wholly anorexic seeks to tame and ultimately to obliterate. Rudolph M. Bell, Holy Anorexia. Carol hated dishonesty. Nothing had hurt her more than other people's lies. Yet she had a terrible secret that she knew would hurt her husband. And the moment had arrived when she knew she had to tell him. The two of them were sitting with their therapist, Miriam. This lovely, wise therapist had seen many couples over her 30 years as a clinician. She surmised that Carol and Chet knew very little about each other's history. They thought they knew, but they did not. As a result, they were struggling as a couple and as individuals. Miriam had asked Chet and Carol to share in detail their individual family histories and their relationship history. Chet had just finished his story of childhood sexual abuse, which was very difficult to hear. In part, it was the sheer pain of his experience that was hard to listen to. Yet also, there were some startling revelations, the implications of which were stunning. Carol was the first to see fully what her therapist already intuitively knew. They had been living an extraordinary lie, and now it was her turn. If she were truthful, the fullness of the deceit would become apparent. When Carol and Chet started their relationship, it was instantly sexual. In fact, they would often talk about how good the sex was, despite all the other problems they had as a couple. They now had 2 small sons, and even their births had not stopped their desire, even if they now had somewhat less opportunity. Chet said a number of times that he was lucky to have a woman so willing. Carol never refused him. Yet therein was part of the lie. Carol hated her sexuality and detested being sexual. She had long believed that to have a husband and family, she had to be sexual. Every orgasm and every sexual initiative she had taken over 9 years of courtship and marriage had been faked. The only genuine orgasms she had experienced were in a very complicated ritual in the bathtub, in which she used the stream of water from the faucet to stimulate herself. And she could only achieve that when alone. Everything else was a sham. Carol had hated her sexuality ever since she was a child. This feeling was usually connected to being with her dad. He would comment on her body, about how cute it was, and say she was growing up nicely. She liked her father's attention and liked to cuddle with him. Yet, when he would cheer her skimpy bathing suits, which were probably inappropriately brief for her age, or express disappointment when she put street clothes back on, she felt very uneasy. When Carol and her 3 sisters were little, her father had taken lots of pictures of them in the bathtub with no clothes on. Seeing these photos as an adult embarrassed Carol and always brought back that bleak, hopeless feeling. Although Carol's father was ultimately successful in his life as an executive, times were tough when Carol was growing up. Money was extremely tight. Very little was spent on the children. The only way Carol could have anything for herself was to work hard at odd jobs and babysitting. She hoarded her money carefully. Her sisters and brother made fun of her, borrowed from her, and in a couple of cases, stole from her. Her father praised her for being hard-working and conservative with money. She also did well in school and worked hard to be the perfect kid, which also brought more approval from Dad. Carol's extreme sense of responsibility and perfectionism brought an additional benefit. Her father was an alcoholic, and when he drank, became violent. Her sisters and brother often caught the brunt of his anger, because they often caused trouble. Carol lived a different rule: make no mistakes, and act as you are expected to act. Carol escaped brutal beatings by living this way. She was a sharp counterpoint to her siblings, all of whom eventually had serious alcohol and drug problems. 2 of her sisters were victims of domestic abuse, and her brother served 18 months in prison for embezzlement. Carol could remember her sister's promiscuity in high school. On a couple of occasions, one of her brother's boyfriends had sex with each of her sisters, all in one afternoon. She was sure her brother had participated in one of these events, but she did not want to know. Her mother did not help. She was more like a buddy to the kids, often siding with them against their father. She was keenly interested in what the kids were doing sexually and was always talking about it. They would frequently talk about boobs, who had them, who did not, who showed them, and who did not. She flirted outrageously with the girls' boyfriends, making suggestive comments. Carol could remember her mom in a low-cut dress bending over and asking the boys how they liked the view. Everyone laughed. Feeling deeply ashamed, Carol went to her room. Carol connected sex with the dysfunction and violence of her family. Filled with terror and shame, she used strategies that worked. Be the good, perfect person who did not make mistakes, and who acted the role expected of her. She also believed to her core that if she were sexual, she would be like her family. With Chet, she was in a bind. To act the role of what was expected of her as a wife would keep her safe, but it also meant she had to be sexual, which filled her with feelings of terror, shame, and anger. She opted for safety. With bitter tears, Carol shared her story with Chet and their therapist. When it came to the point of revealing her dishonesty, she could hardly say she was sorry because of her heartfelt sobs. Yet there was also relief in finally telling her secret. Everyone in the room knew that the truth had shifted reality. Chet and Carol's relationship would never be the same. There was no way to go back once the truth was out. Miriam, the therapist, gently guided Carol out of the bind she was in. First, Miriam observed that we are so used to our own history, we do not see it as remarkable or out of the ordinary, whereas others might see it as horrendous. Further, we tend to minimize that which we feel shameful about. In a culture such as ours that suffers tremendous shame about sex, we tend to be even less candid about that particular issue. Finally, Miriam noted that using courtship as a path out of pain and suffering is often delusional and deceptive. Sex is fundamental to our lives, and it therefore becomes a mirror of our larger issues. Sex is fundamental. As a therapist who has counseled thousands of couples, families, and individuals, I have seen the same lesson emerge over and over again. Sex seems to be the area.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?